In this video, I'm going to cover the communication of the Mosquitto client and server across two distinct servers. One is running my Home Assistant, and one is running Snips, which is the artificial intelligence voice platform. If you don't know much about Snips, it's actually a pretty cool platform that runs audio recognition and interpretation right on the box. So unlike Alexa and Google that go out to the internet or are internet dependent to interpret your voice and your data, your spoken language, Snips does this all on the box itself, and it's touted as a privacy platform. And you can integrate it with Home Assistant. Now, I'm still very new to the integrations from a coding perspective, making it do things, but I've got some trivial connectivity going, and I know that a lot of people have problems, as I struggled early on, getting Mosquitto to talk to each other that are running on the two distinct servers. So let's talk a little bit about the architecture. Ignore this piece here. This is future state. I actually have a Raspberry Pi Zero that I'll be running the Snips satellite in my living room. But for now, this piece is not done yet, so you can ignore this connectivity here. This is just all configuration that'll be relevant to my satellite nodes. Let's just focus on my Home Assistant and my Snips master servers. So I've got two Raspberry Pi B Plus models, Raspberry Pi 3 B Plus. On the USB connection, I have my Z-Wave and Zigbee dongle, USB dongle. I have right now I'm using Wi-Fi, but ultimately I'm going to put this in a server room with the Ethernet switch connected power. And then I've got a Mosquitto server running directly on Home Assistant. So I've installed Mosquitto on here. And we'll talk about how to get Home Assistant to talk directly to that instance. And I've got another Raspberry Pi 3, same model, the 3 Plus, B Plus, running my Snips master node. This unit has the Respeaker 2 mic Pi hat. So I've got two mics on the actual hat, and then I've got audio speaker coming out using a very small, 3-watt speaker. And by default, when you do a SAM init or you install Snips, it has a Mosquitto server that it talks to by default. So we'll configure that. We'll tell Snips Mosquitto server to start listening on this box on two IPs, the actual IP address of the machine and localhost. We'll have Home Assistant talking to its broker, so they'll be independent. And then I'll show you how you can bridge the Snips over to the Home Assistant. And the way that Mosquitto clients works is that when you have a server running and you pass in a bridge communication configuration, which I'll show here shortly, it creates a bridge to another server. Once that connection is made, this bridge will take topics from Home Assistant and replicate them over to this broker, and any topics that are on this broker will be replicated over to Home Assistant. This is how you can get the communication. The bridge is important for a variety of things for topic subscription, and I'll show you how all that stuff works so that you can actually speak to Snips and actually have it execute actions on Home Assistant and actually get feedback back. Once Home Assistant has executed it, you'll get a feedback through the audio. So again, that's the architecture. Let's look at the configuration. So right now I've got my machine that I've already installed Snips, and I've already installed Home Assistant. Now I didn't go through the Home Assistant, the Has.io or Haspian or anything like that. I installed Home Assistant manually because I wanted to learn and do the configuration by hand to make sure everything works. I'm not a big fan of all the kind of one-stop solutions, because I feel like down the road they limit you and you start running into certain specific things to that particular instance or implementation. I just want a vanilla install of Home Assistant, which is why I did this manually. And then Snips I'm not using any add-ons or anything like that for Home Assistant, obviously, because I have a fresh vanilla Home Assistant. For Snips, I just did a SAM init once I recognize my devices. You can go through those tutorials. I'm assuming in this video that you've already got these two things working. So you've got your audio and your microphone working. You've got Home Assistant working all independently, because this video is focused around MQTT. So let's look at the architecture for a second again. So I installed Mosquitto, right? Just doing sudo apt-get install Mosquitto. And so I've got Mosquitto running on my actual Home Assistant and on the Home Assistant master server, and I've got it running on the Snips master server. So I can tell because I've got a Mosquitto client configuration here. Okay, so I've got a mosquitto.conf and Mosquitto password here. I'm gonna make this so we can see it a little bit easier. Okay. So a couple things, right? So let's look at my configuration file. I'm only going to show you the pieces that are relevant to this configuration. So this is not a complete file. I just truncated it for the purposes of this video. So above this, in your configuration YAML, you'll have all your latitude, longitude, all your other components, what have you, right? But for the purposes of this video, I enable the Snips component within Home Assistant so that loads on boot. I also tell it that you're going to use MQTT, and the broker is not going to be an embedded broker, but it's going to use my Mosquitto server that I already installed, right? So here's my IP address of my machine. If you look at ifconfig, there's my wireless LAN right now. So that's my IP address. I tell it the port 1883. For the purposes of the video, I just made it very basic. Username and password are both pi for now. Client, I'm going to tell it that this is the host side, and I told it to discover MQTT client devices in the future automatically. I don't have any right now. So that's my configuration.yaml. Again, broken down just for the purposes of the video. This is what you'll need to add so that once you restart Mosquitto and restart Home Assistant should be talking to Mosquitto directly. If you look at my Mosquitto configuration file, I know a lot of people put persistent equals true and stores a little database. I found it to be a little slow and quirky at times. I may change that in the future. But I don't really care about losing broker messages upon reboot. I don't really need it to restore its present, its state, right? I'm fine with it not being persistent. Allow anonymous, I put false, and then I give it a password path to my password file. Now I've got an example of it here. This is what it looks like, and you can actually create one in your directory by going etc mosquitto and then typing in a username. So you can see it's going to kind of write it there. I'm going to go ahead and execute it here locally, which is my current home directory. So in home pi password file, and I'm going to tell it the username is pi, password is pi, and I create a password file here, which will be stored in etc mosquitto. So when you restart everything, just validate by tailing the Home Assistant logs that Home Assistant loaded the MQTT component and it's talking to it and authenticated, because remember we're using authentication here. So this conf file is actually going to live in etc mosquitto. I just put it in my home directory to clean things up for the purposes of the video. But this file, and I'll put this on my GitHub, by the way, all these things that I'm saying, I'm going to put these examples up on my GitHub, which I'll also have the link in the YouTube video. So this file will sit in etc mosquitto. Password file that you generate will also sit in etc mosquitto, and then the configuration YAML will just sit in your Home Assistant data directory, right, with this configuration. So once that piece is working, you know independently that Home Assistant is talking to MQTT, tail your var log messages, and make sure everything's working fine. You can also tail var log mosquitto mosquito.log and just make sure that you're getting clients connected, right? So that's Snips. Okay. Okay, here we go. Yeah. So there's my client. Ignore the rest of this because that's Snips that's doing that. But new client connected from this address, which is my own address on this machine, as Haas, which was my client. And now I know I've got a connection. If I grep for 1883 for my IP, so I do sudo netstat-an pipe grep my IP of this machine, space pipe grep 1883, you could see that I have this guy is listening on 1883, which is the server, and the same IP, which is the same box, has an established connection to that instance. And again, ignore all this. This is going to be the Snip side, which is my 126 address here. Okay. So now I know that I have Home Assistant and MQTT working correctly together on this box. Now let's look at Snips. Snips by default installs Mosquitto, right? Unlike Home Assistant. By default, Snips installs Mosquitto on the box. And so you have an Mosquitto, and again, I'm putting the relevant files here. This PW file is the same thing I generated. So you could generate Mosquitto password, the file. In your case, you would put it in Mosquitto directory. You do this, and then you give it a username, right? But in my case, I just copied it over here for the purpose of this video. So I've got my Pi user and then a hashed version of my Pi password, right? Very insecure for the purpose of this video. So I'm going to cat out my mosquitto.conf and I'll show you what that looks like. So let's clear the screen for a second. All right, so let's look at all this. All this is pretty much default. I set this to false as I mentioned earlier. I do that. Then I'd say listener 1883. And if you don't put anything after this and you don't have the second line, if you just have listener 1883, it's going to listen on all IP addresses 0.0.0.0. I actually wanted to listen on both IP addresses because I'm going to connect Snips to a local host and I'm going to tell it to bind to this address so that this guy can talk as well, right? Back and forth. So I've got a listing on both IP addresses because by default, when you have a machine, this is my wired network, which is not connected. This is my wireless network, and this is my loopback, right? Loopback is just a box talking to itself. In this case, the box also talks to itself, but on an actual routable IP address. So let's look at my Mosquitto conf file again. So when Mosquitto starts, it's going to bind to both of these addresses. Now let's look at that. I'm going to do netstat-an pipe grep :1883 grep listen. So netstat-an pipe grep, the port I'm requesting that I want to view, and I'm going to grep for anything that's actually listening. So you can see here, see this? I'm listening on localhost on 1883 from everyone. That's what the zeros mean. And I'm also bound to my IP that's on this machine itself that others can get to on 1883 with all zeros, meaning that everyone is allowed. I'm able to listen on from any client to that host. And that's what this piece actually means. This piece makes this happen, okay? The rest of this stuff is pretty default. Allow anonymous false, connection messages equals true, right? Allow anonymous false, again, we're using a password file. You know how to generate that. Put in Etsy Mosquitto. I don't have it there in this video. I have it just locally in my home directory just to show you an example because my actual production version has my actual real passwords, right? So for the purposes of the video, I just made custom ones with the insecure passwords so I can show that on the video. Then I give it a string to start off my bridge connection. So I say this bridge connection is called Snips MQTT. You can call it whatever you want, just an identifier. I could call it Snips2HA or something like that, whatever you want to call it. Then I give it the address and the port. So this is my IP of this machine. I'm bridging it. Remember in this, I'm bridging, this is my bridge back to Home Assistant from Snips. I tell it my remote username is Pi, my remote password is Pi, because in my configuration, I tell it to connect to itself on Pi, and my password file also has authentication for Pi. So I have to actually authenticate, otherwise it's not going to work. Then I'm just saying that I'm going, the client ID I want to track for this connection is just called Snips. Remember, this one was called Haas. This one's going to be called Snips. So here's my client ID. Here's my client ID. Start type automatic, connections, clean, protocol version. Try private, true. I think this is explicit, or this is by default when you start Mosquitto. But try private is always true unless you set it to false, but I like to just put it here in my config to show that I'm actually using it. This you could read up more on it, but it basically prevents, it does loopback detection, so that as messages go back and forth, it doesn't keep routing them over and over again. It recognizes that, hey, I'm the one that sent that, so I shouldn't now subscribe to it as well. And then these are my topics that I'm subscribed to. All the Hermes protocol, right, that Snips exposes, the dialog manager, so in this case, start session, in, my automatic speech recognition, hot word, intent, all this jazz, right? You can just copy and paste this. I'll post all these files on my GitHub. So once that configuration is in place for Mosquitto, let's look at our Snips configuration. So your cat Etsy Snips, which I'm not going to cat here because that's my production one with my real passwords and all that. But for the purposes of this video, I want to show you the only things I changed. The only things I changed were I uncommented this. And you could, I think by default it says here localhost, that works too because it still points to the same IP, but I put the IP here so that it connects to itself, because I'm telling Snips to talk to itself on Mosquitto. Then I give it my authentication, because remember I use the password file, so I have to authenticate all the time. And then in here my audio server, I just put bind equals master, because this guy is my master, and then eventually I'll have satellites like living room, kitchen, etc. That's the only thing that you change in Snips. You could reboot it, the box. I noticed that sometimes Snips and Mosquitto, they don't play well together on reboot because one starts before the other. So in my Etsy RC local, I put a little thing here that says sleep for 10 seconds. After my machine is completely up, this script actually runs at the end of the multi-user run level. Once box is completely ready to go, this script will execute. And so I tell it sleep for 10 seconds and then do a systemctl restart of my Mosquitto service that tells Snips to reconnect, and everything just works. I've had all kinds of problems with the reboot breaking that. So now once that's happened and you've restarted, what you can do is run netstat an grep 1883 and grep for established. Well, first you grep for listen, just to make sure that you're listening on these IPs, right? You should have an output like this. Then you would run netstat-an grep 1883 for established, right? We already know that we're running on both ports because we checked our listen line. Then you got all these loopback ports that are, again, IPs that are connected to itself, because Snips is constantly talking to itself, right, on the MQTT. But if you look here, this 1883, 125, that's this guy, right? That's my Home Assistant. What this line is saying is that my Snips server on some random source port is connected to my Home Assistant server on port 1883. This line right here tells me that not only has Snips started its MQTT server on both IPs so it could talk to itself, but it's also established a connection. Sorry, this line here. It's also established a connection from my Snips server over to Home Assistant. This is the bridge right here. Okay? So now let's do a SAM watch. Okay? Now it's saying watching on this. This is actually talking to this guy because I'm connected, right? If I you would have to do SAM devices, follow those tutorials on how to connect to I could also do Snips watch here, but I just do it for my local machine. So when it says watching on local host, that's actually connected to this machine, right? SAM is executing it on this machine. So it's actually listening to the message bus, Mosquitto, on that machine. And we'll check that things are working by running Mosquitto sub, or I'll run sudo Mosquitto sub. My topic will be Hermes /hash. Username will be pi. And my password will be pi. So if you look at man Mosquitto sub, you could see that it's -u for username and then -P for password. Okay, so let's run that again. Sudo Mosquitto sub. My topic is going to be Hermes, and my username is going to be pi, and then P pi. Okay, so in this case, I don't actually have it running because this is for the purpose of the video. Okay, all right, so now I've actually got my connection with my real password, right? The pi didn't work earlier, got connection unauthorized because these are just for the samples for the video. My actual server is running with a secure password. Let's tail var logs syslog on here. I've got my Mosquitto subscription running on Home Assistant, right? The bridge are talking to each other now. And let's test it out. Jarvis, turn on study light.
Turn study light on.
So my study light came on my master site. That was the bind equals master at MQTT. I have the basic Home Assistant app running on this Snips Assistant for now. And now you can see that I've got the model, I've got session IDs, custom values, all the stuff that I needed to make sure that the audio from here is bridged over to Home Assistant. Home Assistant's Mosquitto got it, and the intent and the app interpreted that slot and turned everything on for me, or in my case, my study light. Jarvis, turn study light off.
Turn study light off.
So you can see I have now bidirectional communication between my Home Assistant and my Snips server. I'll post this architecture diagram on my GitHub. I'll post the configuration samples on my GitHub. And I'll post the GitHub link in this video description.